Eryximachus has an interesting name. You might say his name fated him to become a doctor. It comes from the Machus part of his name, and Eryximachus comes from the word to fight. And the first part of his name, the Eryx part, is the Greek word for a hiccup or a belch. So that literally his name means belch fighter. Perhaps it's not so surprising then that Plato uses the etymology of this name and builds it into the action of the dialogue. Now, Eryximachus was a real man, and that's a real Greek name. But Plato makes use of this by having something interesting happen in the dialogue at this point. Just because of the way the speakers are arranged on the couches, I explain this in a note at the back, it really would be Aristophanes' turn to give a speech after Pausanias. But Aristophanes, it turns out, has the hiccups, and so he's not ready. So Aristophanes says to the doctor, the belch fighter, Eryximachus, says, Eryximachus, you should either cure my hiccups or take my spot. And Eryximachus says, oh, I'll do both. So here are some cures for hiccup you might try, and there's still things people try these days. You can tickle your throat, you can tickle your nose so that you have to sneeze, you can try holding your breath, you can gargle. Now, it's worth remembering that throughout Eryximachus' rather pompous speech about the power of the medical art, throughout, next to him, is Aristophanes, the comic poet, gargling and sneezing and generally taking Eryximachus quite literally and trying to cure his own hiccups. So on the one hand, we've got Eryximachus' great speech about how the medical art is the true way for us to control erotic love and to make it healthy. So the dominant vocabulary is all one about healthiness. Throughout this whole speech, it's accompanied by sound effects from Aristophanes' rather disordered body. Remember, we also know that Aristophanes is suffering the effects of a hangover from the party the previous night. Now, one feature of Eryximachus' speech is a long section on music. Now, in part, this is because for the Greeks, the science of music, the study of the mathematical and the geometrical structure of music, was a recent and great accomplishment. It had a lot of scientific prestige. So Eryximachus wants to use the prestige of music theory with its geometrical theory of proportions particularly. He wants to use that scientific prestige and apply the musical model to the control of erotic love. So throughout this medical musical speech of Aristophanes, we have the rather unmusical accompaniments of Aristophanes' garglings, ticklings, and sneezings. And at the end of Eryximachus' speech, when Eryximachus finally gets to the end, now Eryximachus is the kind of lecturer who, even if everybody's laughing and carrying on, instead of stopping and say, hey, quit laughing and carrying on, he just plunges right ahead. He finally gets to the end of his speech, And he looks over at Aristophanes and says, well, I've come to my end of my speech, which is a good thing because I see that your hiccups are finally over. And Aristophanes says, yeah, it's great. But you know, it's really counterintuitive that this orderly body that you've been talking about in your speech, that medicine produces for us, only comes about through these incredibly disorderly sounds of garglings and ticklings and sneezings. So Aristophanes is making fun of Eryximachus' speech, of the rhetoric of scientific prestige that Eryximachus is relying on to present himself as Dr. Love, as the love expert, the Dr. Ruth of his day. So here's another way in which the action of the dialogue provides a kind of commentary on the content of the actual speeches. Eryximachus, after all, was the guy who, at the beginning of the speeches, gave his professional medical opinion that it really would be a good thing the day after you'd had a big drunk not to have another big drunk. That really it's better for the body to drink in moderation, especially if you've already got a hangover. And Phaedrus had already poked a bit of gentle fun at his friend by saying, you know, Eryximachus, I always listen to your medical advice. But in this case, I think everybody will pay attention to you. Clearly the implication being, you know, Eryximachus, we hear you spouting off with this advice all the time about how to live a healthy life. Cut down on your trans fats or whatever the most recent thing is. Have they labeled trans fats in the dining halls yet? They have big flashing signs or something, warning, deep fried. I was eating there once over the summer. My daughters think it's the best restaurant in the whole world. And clearly labeled, vegetable soup, full of beef. So don't trust even a flashing sign in the dining hall. So he's a nutrition expert. He can tell you everything you need to know to live a nice, moderate, or in a word that students seem to love, a balanced life. It's all about balance. Maintaining your equilibrium. Got to have some fun parts scheduled in on your BlackBerry or whatever the machines are. A personal, what are they, a PDA? Isn't that a public display of affection? What an amazing innovation in erotic vocabulary. You know, you got to schedule in some fun stuff, some study stuff, some Christian volunteerism. So, you know, you get body, soul, heaven. It's all kind of arranged in there. Eryximachus, he's that kind of a guy. He has a planner. Has a whole calendar for you. So his speech, as he makes perfectly clear, is really a praise of himself, but himself as a representative of a certain kind of technological control, a certain kind of scientific control over the challenges and the disorderliness of erotic life. And this is why Phaedrus, near the beginning, and Aristophanes, at the end of Eryximachus' speech, make fun of him. Because they think that there's clearly something very overstated in this scientizing view. But besides the rather comical aspect of a kind of parody of a medical professional's view of erotic life in Eryximachus' speech, there are a number of serious themes that get on the table in part because Eryximachus brings them up, and they'll be developed in later speeches. Think again of the centrality of music as a model for Eryximachus. Phaedrus' speech and Pausanias' speech both make some use out of poets, but they don't make much use of the very common notion that poetry, music broadly conceived, has a particularly intimate connection to erotic life and erotic experience. It may be that many people nowadays learn quite a bit about their erotic lives from doctors, but it's still true that for most people, they get their ideas about what erotic life would be, about what a romance is, about how to kiss somebody, from watching movies or from reading works of literature. So there's still a central role for poetry, again, broadly conceived, within our sense of romance, of the romantic life, of falling in love. Now, in Eryximachus, this topic gets on the table for discussion. It's true, he wants to control music too by making it scientific. He wants to bring it all under the control of the medical art eventually. But even by doing that, he introduces the question of music into the discussion of love in the symposium in a way that wasn't really prominent as a theme in Phaedrus' speech and in Pausanias' speech. So that even though Phaedrus' speech is built around reflection on literary examples, most importantly Achilles, but not just Achilles, Orpheus, Alcestis, even though it's built around those literary examples, Phaedrus' own anxieties about how macho love is, or about how to keep it macho, something suitable for manliness, tends to suppress the fact that what he knows or how he thinks about love really is coming from a poetic background. Phaedrus presents himself as if he learned all about love in boot camp, as if it's being a military man that really shows him the way to true love. But in fact, it's being a lover of poetry. So, that theme now becomes more prominent in the symposium than it was before. You might say it was latent as an anxiety or a problem, the problem about the softness of poetry and music compared to a certain ideology of being a real man. The problem was there, the anxiety was there, but now it's gotten on the table ready for conversation in Eryximachus' speech. A second theme that Eryximachus' speech puts on the table that wasn't there before is the question about the way love is a vehicle of human access to something sacred or divine. Now, here again, you might say this was latent in Pausanias' speech. After all, Pausanias introduces his own analysis of love by saying there are two loves because there are two gods of love, two gods, eros, corresponding to the two goddesses, Aphrodite. One, an all-male Aphrodite, the elder, and the other, an androgynous Aphrodite, the younger and the less controlled one. So clearly Pausanias thinks of love as having a divine aspect. But yet when he talks about the actual experience of love, it's all about education. It's almost as if love would be more convenient and would have a kind of conceptual clarity for Pausanias If only we didn't have bodies at all. Eryximachus introduces the notion that the art of love, which for him is a medical art, also allows us to practice in the right way the art of divination. Divination, that is, that art, that practice that allows human beings to read divine purposes out of the experience of everyday life, or to bring us closer to the gods in the practices of ritual life, such as sacrifice and prayer. Now, here again we see the prejudices, the bias of Eryximachus in looking for scientific control, because oddly enough, he seems to treat divination as if it's something that a real scientific knowledge allows us to take over, so that we can control our interactions with the gods, with the divinity possible or open to us in our lives. Whereas you might have thought, and indeed I think that the Greek readers of Plato's own time would have thought, that the need for divination, the need for petitionary prayer, where we ask the gods for things, those needs show human limitation, not human power. They show that we have to be open to something, receptive of something from the gods, rather than showing that we have some technique that allows us to get what we want from the gods. So here again, there's a theme that was latent in the earlier speeches, particularly in Pausanias' speech this time. There's a theme that was latent there, but that's now made an explicit theme in Eryximachus' speech. So it's available for the later speakers to take up this theme about divination, about love as a vehicle toward something divine or sacred. But when they take it up, they're much less, let's say, aggressively optimistic about the human ability to control that access to the divine, to get what we want out of it. Eryximachus' speech is intended, I take it, to be rather comical. There's an aspect of parody in his speech. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a serious point. The first three speeches form a kind of set together. And the dialogue then makes something of a new start when it gets to Aristophanes' speech. I think that most readers of the symposium, whether they would all articulate it in the same way or not, would very quickly say that the first three speeches are all somehow less interesting, less thoughtful, less stimulating to thought than the speeches that follow. So that we have a kind of pairing of these speeches. This first triple is a way of getting on the agenda a whole series of questions about the nature of erotic love. None of the speeches are very satisfying as accounts of erotic love, but yet they're very perceptive as views of the anxieties that might be provoked in us by coming to terms with erotic love. And I use coming to terms with there quite literally. They're seeking for a vocabulary. They're looking for the right words so that the structures of their language will correspond to the structures of their erotic world. It's part of Plato's specific genius as a writer to be able to take specific words, or you might say small bundles of related words, a vocabulary, and to go through the resources, both the positive resources and the limitations in those resources. What can you think about love if you sound like Phaedrus? What can you think about love if you sound like Pausanias? And what can you think about love if you sound like Eryximachus? Part of the thought experiment of the symposium is to go through a whole set of speakers to see what can be done within a particular distinctive and, in its way, limited vocabulary. One more theme that Eryximachus' speech gets us closer to that I want to point out. Here it's not that Eryximachus makes fully explicit something that's only latent in the other speeches. I think even with him it's only latent. It'll become fully explicit only in the next speech, in Aristophanes' speech. And this is the problem about androgyny. That is, how do we understand human erotic capacity without, how do we understand human erotic capacities in a way that respects the difference between male and female experience? And given the context of this particular drinking party, it's not surprising that the main anxiety here is that somehow maleness is going to be infected by, infiltrated by, something effeminate. We saw how powerfully this anxiety works itself out in Phaedrus' speech and in Pausanias' speech. Eryximachus' speech, I think, without knowing it, starts to put pressure on a sharp distinction between male and female, starts to push us toward an image of love that makes it look like our richest experiences of falling in love will be things in which we combine male and female elements, in which the way that a specific culture codes what's male and what's female starts to break down. Those boundaries don't hold up very well. How does this happen in Eryximachus' speech? Well, Pausanias introduced this distinction between the earthy Eros, or the earthy Aphrodite, and the heavenly Aphrodite and the heavenly Eros. Eryximachus wants to use that distinction. But think of how Pausanias introduces it. Pausanias wants that distinction between what's heavenly and what's earthy to track the difference between the soul and the body. The body is all earth, and therefore it's merely androgynous. Notice it's not female, it's androgynous. The earthy eros, earthy love, is love that really doesn't make a distinction between male and female objects, whereas the heavenly eros is only focused on male objects. Now, there's a lot one could say about that, but all I want to focus on right now is that you get a very sharp soul versus body distinction in Pausanias' speech. The orderly and heavenly love is all about the soul. The disorderly and earthy love is all about the body. Eryximachus, though, is a medical man, and so his authority rests on claims not just about the soul, but also about the body, about the natural world, not just about a heavenly world. So when Eriximachus redeploys this distinction between heavenly love and earthly love, he says that it applies both to the soul and to the body. In other words, from Eriximachus's point of view, we can't delimit an all-male love from an androgynous love simply by dividing up the soul from the body. Somehow there are resources within the soul itself for both a healthy love and an unhealthy love. And similarly, there are resources within the body itself for both a healthy love and an unhealthy love. The work that Pausanias tried so laboriously to do, the work of defending the pedagogical interest of the lover, is implicitly broken down by Eriximachus's claim that within the psychic interest, therefore the pedagogical interest, there is the potential for some sort of androgyny. Now, Eriximachus doesn't do much with this. Eriximachus doesn't explicitly challenge the sort of macho ideology that's in Phaedrus' speech and especially in Pausanias' speech. But still, the work that Eriximachus is doing with Pausanias' own distinction between the heavenly and the earthly turns out to undermine one of the main points that Pausanias makes. One of the things that's going to happen then is that Aristophanes, who has a very good ear and is very observant, he's going to see this problem, and he will make it one of the central themes of the story he tells about the origin and nature of romantic love. That's what we'll talk about on Wednesday.